Hi, this is Hilton Kiesno, host of The Moss Show, a podcast covering all things SharePoint related at www.themossshow.com. In this video, we're going to look at how to create alternate URLs for your SharePoint site so that it can be addressed on these alternate URLs, for example, perhaps over the internet or extranet. This approach is primarily known as an alternate access mapping in SharePoint, and you'll see that we'll go ahead and create these, but we'll look at some different ways that we can accomplish this as well, and some of the benefits and drawbacks. So to start off here, you can see I'm running on the local server, and I have a site running under localhost there. I can address it under the machine name as well, so I'm just going to log in again and you'll see that resolving. So I could access it elsewhere on the network, for example, using this machine name, and you'll notice that this current site is on the default port 80 as well. Now, for me to go ahead and give this an alternate entry that it can be accessed on, I can do that on the local machine by going ahead and adding a hosts entry. For example, I could do this on one of the other machines in the network as well. So you'll see, for example, I've gone ahead and put www.mysite.com. So I could go ahead and set up my firewall or router or router, however you pronounce it, to go ahead and configure this to do this. And you can see here, for example, it'll go ahead and give me a prompt and allow me to log in if I've got everything set up correctly. However, this approach is not ideal in SharePoint for a variety of different reasons. SharePoint doesn't actually recognize this URL, it's just a pointer. So if it did resolve, it would go ahead and convert it into the name that we had underneath. And this would give problems specifically to external users. In addition, for example, if users had signed up to email alerts and they'd come in via this approach, the hyperlinks inside of these email alerts would not be accessible, as they wouldn't resolve correctly. So this is just one example of why we want to go ahead and set up the infrastructure inside of SharePoint correctly. And in order to do this, we want to create what's called an alternate access mapping to an existing site collection, or web application at least. So you can see I've got one selected here, and SharePoint gives me up to 5 different URLs I can configure under what's called different zones here. So for example, I can make sure I'm on the correct website and go ahead and create a new URL in there directly, or I can go to this edit public list and go ahead and capture them in here, for example. However, this also, while this would work, is not necessarily the best approach. What we're going to be doing is instead going ahead, selecting the web application and going ahead and extending it. The reason to do this is you can see, for example, authentication providers listed as an option there. If we go ahead and extend our current web application to an additional alternate IIS or SharePoint web application, which in this case also means an additional IIS website, as we'll see in a moment, we can go ahead and configure alternate security settings as well, as we'll do a little bit later. So I come in here and I want to go ahead and configure the new IIS website. If you go ahead and create a new web application entirely, you'll recognize the screen as it's the mostly the same settings. But I'm going to go ahead and set some different ones here because we're extending an existing site. So you'll see I'm going to give it a host header to be the external URL that I'd like to resolve in this case. And this is because I want to actually have this web application answering in addition on an alternate live internet URL. For example, if I wanted to have an alternate security authorization mechanism for those coming over the net, as an example. I could just decide to have it as an internal name on the network that's a bit different, in which case we could use the same approach and go ahead and specify a host header here as well. And in that case, we'd have to make sure to set up an entry in the enterprise's DNS records as well. What I'm going to do here as well, just to illustrate that you can use it to set up these kind of differences, is I'm going to not just have a standard host header entry, but I'm going to go ahead and specify that the new URL must have a different port as well. And again, this is not necessary. Certainly traffic over the internet you probably want to leave on port 80. This is just to illustrate how this can be done. And of the additional zones that I could go ahead and use, I'm going to specify that this one is going to be the internet zone. So let's go ahead and set OK on that and have these settings saved. And this will take a little bit of time because it's going ahead and creating the additional records inside of the SharePoint database, but it's also going ahead and provisioning an entirely new IIS website as well. So once this is done, in fact we can just go ahead while it's towards the end of its processing there and load up IIS so long, just while that's finishing. and we'll see if any of the details have come through into IIS. Well, the SharePoint bit has actually finished its work, so we should be able to see all of the changes come through correctly here. So in IIS, I'm going ahead under the Sites section, and there we go. We can see that the new IIS website has been created for me. And in addition, we can see that the bindings have been set correctly as well. So it's now answering on the alternate URL that I wanted to answer on. Again, this is something we could, for example, have done on the default SharePoint AT website. I've gone ahead and set these bindings in IIS directly, but again, this would have bypassed the SharePoint infrastructure and not been a recommended approach. The advantage also of having this separate website is that, as I mentioned, we can go ahead and set different settings for this particular web application as well, or extended web application, shall I say. So, for instance, we can go ahead and set different authentication and authorization rules inside of the web config file, because we have an additional web config file. Also, if we look inside of SharePoint under the authentication providers for the default web application, you can see I can go ahead and specify different settings for this internet zone. So as an example, I'm going to go ahead and set basic authentication on and turn off the Windows authentication. You'll notice I also have the option there to go ahead and set forms authentication, but this is different in SharePoint 2010, as this uses a claims-based approach, which we'll hopefully see in a later video in the series. So I've clicked save here. Let's just wait for these settings to be actually saved to the database and for the changes to be reflected. And once that's done, we'll be able to go ahead and load up our new URL pointing to the same web application, but under a different IIS website. So that's the extended web application, and we'll see that hopefully in a short while. Let's just let these settings save. There we go. You can see that it's just showing us there that both authentication providers are still using Windows authentication, but the new one's going to answer under basic settings. If I go back into the alternate access mappings, you can see that it's specifying the two options here for the specific web application, and we can go to that full list and see all of them there, in this case just the two of them. I'm now going to try and hit the actual website that we specified at the port we specified as well, and give that a chance to come up. This again will take a bit of time because it's effectively compiling the entire infrastructure for this specific address that it needs to answer on for this IIS website for the first time. So this can take a couple of seconds, and it's prompting us again for the login details, of course, because it's IE is recognizing that it's under a different website. And once we capture our actual user details there, and again just give it a few seconds, it should go ahead and bring up the actual website. And there we go. We can see it's bringing up the same website as we had before. So this is an alternate and additional URL to exactly the same content, exactly the same SharePoint site collection and a web application underneath. One thing to note is the little alert up at the top there. You may be trying to access the site from a secured browser and so on. Because we are now accessing it from a different URL, and specifically one that looks like a live internet URL, we need to go ahead, for example, and set this particular address to be a trusted site, for instance, if we want all of the client tools to work correctly. So in this video, we've seen how to go ahead and configure an alternate access mapping, and we've seen specifically how to do this by creating an additional extended website in IIS, so that we can extend our single web application across multiple zones. If you've got any questions on this video, you can contact me at hilton@geeseno.com, or you can contact Microsoft directly at tellus@microsoft.com.